The first proverb in verse 1 is about dishonest business practices. The proverb is of a simple binary type, which is very common, expressing one thing and then stating its opposite. False weights used in the markets are an abomination to the Lord. Using false weights was proscribed in the law, and later the prophets used the practice as an example of the type of dishonesty and injustice that was rife among God's people. To call it an abomination is particularly strong. The opposite clause simply states that an accurate weight is his delight. There is a very similar proverb in verse 20 as well. Everyone hates and fears being cheated. Some places are notorious for it, like car dealerships. The problem is worse if you are poor. Crooked weights could either be too heavy, resulting in the customer getting less than what they paid for, or too light, resulting in them getting a smaller payment for something they might have sold. God is not merely frustrated or annoyed at such practices. To him they are an abomination. The proverb speaks to the just nature of God. But what does one do with a proverb like this? It is at least a comfort to know that God is as outraged as you are over your loss in the market. But the businessman must consider whether he wants his conduct to reflect God's character. Judgment is not mentioned, but only a fool would not think of it. The proverb works by making a simple statement of contrasts, and then leaves you space to decide how God's character will impact yours and your subsequent behavior. The second proverb in verse 2 is the origin for the famous saying about pride coming before a fall. Wisdom, however, is with the humble. In Proverbs, wisdom and humility are constantly associated with each other. This is another contrastive proverb, but it is not a complete one. If it were, we would expect something like, "But the humble will be exalted." Does this mean that there is no sure reward for the humble? Perhaps it implies that wisdom is the reward of the humble, and the humble need no exaltation, and for that matter, need not fear disgrace. A humble person cannot suffer as much humiliation as a proud one, and besides, wisdom will guide a humble person around the pitfalls which might bring that disgrace. In this proverb, then, the lack of a complete parallel in the contrast forces us to think about it in more depth. The Proverbs from verses 3 to 11 are mainly concerned with a contrast between the righteous and the wicked. One point which a number of them make is that in practical terms, good and bad behavior over time lead to appropriate results. The proverb in verse 7 does not have a contrast in it. Instead, the second line expands the point of the first. Verses 12 and 13 are about speech, and then 13 specifically mentions gossip, which Proverbs repeatedly warns about. Verse 12 again makes the link between silence and wisdom, which we have seen in 10:14 and 19. Learning how to be quiet and not talk too much, especially gossip or criticism of people higher than you, like the king, is a key lesson of Proverbs. Verse 16 is a longer proverb which seems to contrast the way in which men and women gain honour, or their particular reward. It is presented in two sets of contrasts. A gracious woman gets honour, but the one who hates virtue gets shame. A timid man becomes poor, but the strong or aggressive get riches. The overall comparison may imply that women need to behave well to be esteemed, whereas men must achieve something. How should we react to this proverb? Taken separately, we can be inspired by the observations about being gracious if we are female, and being strong or aggressive if we are male. But when they are both compared, what should we think? Perhaps this proverb is just one of those that is simply observational at the larger level. Verses 24 to 26 contain three proverbs on the theme of generosity. The first one, in verse 24, contrasts those who give freely and those who withhold. But each line contrasts itself in terms of action and outcome. Some give things away, yet somehow get richer. Some hold on to things, yet somehow have need. How does this mechanism work? The proverb is not talking about a final reversal like Jesus describes, particularly in the Beatitudes. The book of Proverbs rarely looks beyond this life. Is richness literal? Does it mean people like a kind person and reward them? Or does it mean something spiritual, that someone who can give things away will only find greater contentment, whereas someone who clings fearfully or selfishly to what they have can never enjoy it and will always want more and worry about losing it? Verse 1 of chapter 12 contrasts the attitudes of the wise and the stupid in regard to rebuke or correction. This is a recurring wisdom theme, and there is a similar thought in verse 15. Elsewhere in the Bible, discipline is encouraged to be seen as God's loving interest in us. In this proverb, discipline is the path to knowledge. Whoever would be wise must tolerate correction, and in time will come to seek it out. The link between wisdom and humility here, though not stated, is obvious. Good speech is commended again in verses 6, 13, 14, and perhaps 16. Then there are three more in verses 17, 18, and 19, which highlight the public or social implications for truthful speech. There is another in verse 22, and here the same words abomination and delight are used, as they were twice in chapter 11 regarding crooked business practices. In verses 18 and 25, the power of speech to heal and encourage is highlighted, reminding us of our ability to use our tongues for good instead of evil. Bad speech in Proverbs consists of lies, babbling, gossip, boasting, and carelessness. But good speech is thoughtful, restrained, aimed at healing or peacemaking, even if it must come through rebuke. A key part of restraint is humility, which comes from not being sure of all the answers or knowing all the facts, and not assuming that your voice is the one that most needs to be heard. It also protects confidential information, which of course is the opposite of gossip. No wonder that James says, anyone who makes no mistakes in speaking is perfect. How much do we all need to hear this, especially in the age of social media?